Picture this: a lone Viking longship cutting through the stormy North Atlantic, its crew surrounded by nothing but endless waves and howling winds, no compass. No maps as we know them today, just the vast, unpredictable sea stretching in every direction. Yet somehow, these Norse explorers charted courses across thousands of miles, reaching lands as far as North America, all while navigating some of the most treacherous waters on Earth. How did they do it? That's the mystery that's puzzled historians for centuries. Even today, experts can't fully agree on the secrets behind Viking navigation. Some theories sound almost mythical, like their supposed use of magical sunstones to peer through clouds, while others hint at an astonishing grasp of natural phenomena we're only now beginning to understand. These weren't just sailors, they were master navigators who read the stars, the waves, even the behavior of birds, turning the ocean itself into a roadmap. And while modern technology has unraveled many ancient puzzles, the Vikings' methods remain shrouded in debate, a tantalizing blend of myth, ingenuity, and lost wisdom. This journey we're about to take isn't just about uncovering tools or technique. It's about stepping into the mindset of explorers who saw the world differently. Imagine trusting the flight path of a seabird to guide you to land, or deciphering the subtle shifts in ocean currents with nothing but intuition and experience. From sunstones to shadow boards, from folklore to cutting-edge archaeology, we'll explore 25 of the most hotly debated navigation secrets that let the Vikings conquer the seas. So hold tight, because by the end, you'll never look at the open ocean the same way again. One of the most intriguing tools in Viking navigation lore is the Sunstone, a mysterious crystal said to cut through the veil of overcast skies. Legend claims these Norse sailors could hold it up to the clouds, and somehow it revealed the hidden sun's position like a celestial compass. But was this real, or just another tale spun from the mists of time? Recent archaeology hints at truth behind the myth. In a shipwreck off the coast of Alderney, researchers found a piece of Icelandic spar, a type of calcite crystal known for its light polarizing properties. When tilted at just the right angle, it can filter sunlight, reducing glare and revealing the sun's direction even on heavily clouded days. Modern experiments have put this to the test. Sailors using replicas of these sunstones could pinpoint the sun's location with surprising accuracy, often within a few degrees. Yet skeptics argue, could Vikings really have mastered such advanced optics? No written manuals survive, and the technique would have required precise knowledge of light's behavior, something we often assume was beyond their era. Some historians suggest the sunstone was just one tool among many, perhaps reserved for the most skilled navigators or dire situations when the heavens offered no other clues. Others wonder if its prominence in sagas was more symbolic, a way to elevate their seafaring prowess into the realm of legend. What's undeniable is the sheer ingenuity at play. Whether the Sunstone was commonplace or a rare, elite secret, it reflects a culture that didn't just brave the unknown, they decoded it, using every scrap of knowledge the natural world offered. And that's a mystery still shimmering beneath the surface, waiting for the next wave of discovery. Buried beneath the frozen soil of a Norse farmstead in Greenland, the Uunartoq Disc emerged as a small wooden artifact with a big mystery etched into its surface. Roughly the size of a dinner plate, this ancient object bears carefully carved notches and a central hole features that sparked a fierce debate among historians. Was this a child's toy, a household tool, or something far more remarkable? A Viking sun compass. The theory goes like this: on a clear day, a navigator could place a wooden gnomon or shadow casting pin into the disc's center. As the sun moved across the sky, the shadow's path would align with the carved markings, acting like a crude but effective sundial. By tracking these shadows, a skilled sailor could approximate cardinal directions or even adjust their course along a latitude line. Experimental archaeology lends weight to this idea. Modern reconstructions of the disk, when tested at sea, proved accurate enough to guide a ship within a navigational margin Vikings would have found acceptable. But not everyone's convinced. Critics point out that the Uunartoq disc lacks the precision of later medieval navigation tools, and its fragmented state leaves room for interpretation. Some argue it might have been a simple decorative piece or even a teaching aid for young sailors rather than a practical instrument. The Greenland settlement where it was found also raises questions. Was this tool widely used or a localized improvisation by Norse colonists adapting to the Arctic's relentless daylight? What makes the debate so fascinating is what it reveals about Viking ingenuity. Whether the disc was a dedicated navigational aid or a multi-purpose tool repurposed for survival, it underscores a broader truth. The Norse didn't rely on a single method. They layered knowledge upon knowledge, turning shadows, stars, and even guesswork into a system that defied the limits of their age. And that adaptability might just be the greatest navigation secret of all. Among the most ingenious and hotly debated Viking navigation tools is what historians call the shadow board. Picture a simple wooden slab with carefully carved markings, paired with a central gnomon to cast shadows in sunlight. On land, such devices could easily track time or direction, but out on the open ocean, that's where the controversy begins. Proponents of the shadow board theory point to Norse sagas and archaeological fragments that hint at its use. The concept was straightforward. By observing how shadows shifted across the board's markings throughout the day, sailors could gauge cardinal directions or even estimate their latitude. Some reconstructions suggest that on a stable ship during calm seas, a skilled navigator might achieve reasonable accuracy, especially when combined with other methods like sunstones or star sightings. Yet critics raise valid concerns. The North Atlantic was anything but calm. How reliable could a shadow board be on a deck pitching with waves? Even minor tilting could throw off measurements dramatically, and overcast skies would render it useless. Unlike the Uunartoq disc, which might have served for rough orientation, the shadow board's precision would demand near-perfect conditions, but here's where context matters. Vikings didn't rely on a single tool, they layered techniques. A shadow board might have been most practical near shorelines or during seasonal migrations when weather patterns were more predictable. And let's not underestimate their adaptability. These were sailors who could read wind patterns and whale migrations. If a shadow board offered even occasional guidance, it would have been one more thread in their navigational tapestry. The debate ultimately reveals something deeper. Whether the shadow board was a daily tool or a situational aid, its very possibility underscores the Vikings' relentless creativity. In an age without modern instruments, they turned sunlight itself into a compass, proving once again that their greatest skill wasn't just sailing, it was learning to listen to the world around them. Ever wonder why Norse sagas so often mention birds in tales of perilous sea voyages? There's a reason beyond poetic flair. Vikings paid excruciating attention to seabird behavior, turning feathered creatures into living compasses. When land was nowhere in sight, a lone puffin circling overhead or the direction of gulls returning at dusk could mean the difference between salvation and disaster. But just how reliable was this avian radar, and did it really guide them across vast stretches like the North Atlantic? Take the story of Floki Vilhjalmsson, one of the first Norse explorers to intentionally sail to Iceland. Legend says he released ravens from his ship, a technique borrowed from earlier Norse traditions. If the bird flew in a straight line, he'd follow. If it circled aimlessly, land was still far off. It sounds almost fanciful, but modern experiments suggest there's science beneath the saga. Many seabirds, like fulmars or kittiwakes, follow predictable flight paths between feeding grounds and nesting sites, especially at dawn and dusk. A Viking sailor with keen eyes might notice gulls flying lower when nearing coastlines or changing direction toward hidden islands obscured by the horizon's curve. Yet the debate among historians is fierce. Critics argue that bird behavior alone couldn't sustain long-haul navigation. After all, seabirds often range hundreds of miles from land, and mistaking a wandering albatross for a shore-bound gull could lead a ship fatally off course. Plus, fog or storms would obscure flight patterns entirely. But supporters counter that Vikings likely layered this method with others, using birds as a final clue when other signs, like shifts in wave patterns or the smell of earth-laden winds, hinted land was near. Perhaps the most compelling evidence comes from ecology itself. In the Faroe Islands and Norway, certain seabird species still nest in colonies visible from sea routes Vikings frequented. A navigator memorizing these nesting zones could effectively use them as waypoints, like invisible buoys marking the way. And let's not forget the psychological boost. Spotting a bird after weeks at sea wasn't just practical, it was hope carved into wings. So was bird watching a Viking GPS, not quite. But in a world without charts, it was one more thread in their intricate web of survival, proof that sometimes the oldest navigators weren't the stars or the seas, but the creatures that bridged both. Some of the Norse sagas whisper of an unexpected ally in Viking navigation, not ravens or stars, but the massive, rhythmic presence of whales. The theory goes that seasoned sailors might have tracked migrating pods, recognizing that these ocean giants often moved between feeding grounds near coastlines and deeper waters. After all, where whales gathered in numbers, land was rarely far behind. But was this deliberate strategy or just a happy coincidence Vikings learned to exploit? The argument gains traction when you consider the biology of species like humpbacks or orcas, which still follow predictable routes along Norway's coast and across the North Atlantic today. In spring, they chase herring shoals into fjords. By autumn, they retreat to open waters. A navigator observing these patterns could theoretically stitch together a mental map, whale movements acting like living signposts pointing toward sheltered bays or islands. Even whale behavior offered clues. Breaching near shorelines or changes in diving patterns might signal shallow shelves unseen from the surface, yet historians remain divided. Skeptics point out that whale migrations aren't always reliable. Shifting currents or prey could divert pods for miles off typical paths, and while sagas mention whales, they rarely frame them as navigational tools. Instead, whales appear as hazards, resources, or even omens. The famous King's Mirror, a medieval Norse text, advises sailors to avoid whales altogether, warning of their potential to capsize ships. Could Vikings really have relied on creatures they simultaneously feared? Supporters counter with practicality. These were people who thrived by reading nature's subtlest cues. Even if not a formal system, spotting a pod might trigger a sailor's memory of past voyages, like recognizing landmarks. And in the fog-bound stretches between Greenland and Iceland, where other methods failed, the distant blow of a whale could cut through the silence as both comfort and compass. The debate ultimately hinges on how we define navigation. If we imagine Vikings consulting whales like a chart, the theory wobbles. But if we see it as one thread in their vast, intuitive understanding of the sea, a way to cross-reference winds, currents, and animal behavior, it becomes another stroke of their genius. Whales didn't give them coordinates, they offered rhythm, a pulse in the chaos that said follow, and you might just find home. Darkness falls over the North Atlantic, and with it comes one of the most reliable guides the Vikings ever knew, the stars. Polaris, the North Star, hangs fixed in the heavens while other constellations wheel around it, a celestial anchor that could mean survival for sailors far from land. But how precise was stellar navigation for the Norse, especially when clouds rolled in or the horizon vanished into stormy blackness? Unlike later mariners with sextants and almanacs, Viking navigators relied on naked eye astronomy and generations of oral tradition. Polaris' near constant position above the North Celestial Pole made it invaluable. By measuring its angle above the horizon with nothing but a hand or a simple wooden device, they could estimate their latitude. Sagas like the King's Mirror even suggest they used a bearing dial, a primitive tool that might have helped align stars to maintain course. Yet skeptics argue that without accurate timekeeping or written records, stellar navigation would have been rough at best. Polaris shifts slightly over centuries due to Earth's axial precession, meaning its position in the Viking Age wasn't exactly where we see it today. Could they have compensated for that drift through observation alone? Supporters of the theory point to the Norse's deep familiarity with the night sky. Constellations like the Big Dipper, called Karlsvon, Charles's wagon in Old Norse, were more than myths, they were practical markers. A navigator might note that when a certain star touched the masthead at midnight, land lay 2 days west, but clouds were the wild card. Unlike the Sunstone's purported ability to pierce overcast skies, stars offered no such shortcuts. Fog or storms could leave sailors effectively blind, forcing them to fall back on waves, wind, or even the taste of seawater for clues. The debate grows richer when we consider seasonal variations. During summer in high latitudes, the midnight sun erased stars for weeks, yet this was prime sailing season. Did Vikings switch entirely to solar methods, or had they memorized stellar positions well enough to navigate by twilight's faint glimmers? One Icelandic saga describes a navigator waiting for night to grow old before correcting course, suggesting an intimate grasp of celestial rhythms. Perhaps the most compelling evidence lies in their results. Vikings reached Greenland, Iceland, and even Newfoundland, journeys impossible by luck alone. Whether Polaris was their GPS or just one tool among many, the stars were part of a larger, living map written in wind, waves, and the shimmering dark above. And that map was precise enough to conquer an ocean. Imagine standing on the deck of a Viking longship, the horizon empty in every direction, no landmarks, no birds, just the endless roll of the sea beneath you. Yet for Norse navigators, those very waves and winds weren't obstacles, they were a language. The ocean spoke in swells and gusts, and the Vikings learned to listen. But was this understanding a precise science passed down through generations, or simply the hard-won intuition of sailors who'd spent lifetimes at the mercy of the elements? The sagas offer tantalizing clues. In one account, a navigator named Otter boasted he could sail from Norway to England blindfolded, guided only by the feel of the waves beneath his ship. It sounds like bravado, but modern researchers suspect there's truth beneath the legend. The North Atlantic's wave patterns aren't random. They're shaped by prevailing winds and the contours of distant coastlines. A seasoned sailor might recognize the long, rolling swells that form near Iceland's continental shelf, distinct from the choppier turbulence of the English Channel. Even wind direction carried meaning. In regions like the Baltic, summer breezes often blew predictably from the northeast, while winter storms could shift abruptly from the west, knowledge that could mean the difference between a swift voyage and disaster. But critics push back. Unlike stars or sunstones, waves and winds are notoriously fickle. A storm hundreds of miles away could distort swells, and local currents might muddle the signals. Without written records, how could Vikings have systematized such fluid data? Some historians argue their expertise was less a formal method and more a mosaic of lived experience, tribal elders teaching young sailors to associate certain wave rhythms with nearby fjords, or recognizing how wind ripples differed near sheltered bays. Yet archaeology hints at something more deliberate. Recovered ship logs from later medieval Norse traders note wind patterns with meticulous detail, suggesting at least some of this knowledge was recorded and shared. And let's not forget the physicality of Viking ships themselves. Their shallow drafts made them unusually responsive to subtle shifts in current, allowing navigators to feel the sea's nuances in ways bulkier vessels couldn't. The debate boils down to two perspectives. One sees wave navigation as an art, an instinct honed by years of saltwater and storms. The other imagines a more structured tradition where apprentices memorized wave sequences like verses in a poem, each crest and trough a syllable in the ocean story. Perhaps the truth lies in between. Vikings thrived by merging observation with adaptability, turning chaos into compass. After all, when the sky darkened and the stars vanished, the sea itself became their map. And that map didn't need to be perfect, just good enough to get them home. The Norse weren't just masters of the open ocean, they were cunning coastal pilots, threading their longships through narrow fjords and skerries with precision that still baffles modern sailors. Unlike the vast star-guided crossings to Greenland or Vinland, much of their travel involved what historians call island hopping, staying within sight of land whenever possible. But was this cautious approach their default strategy, or merely a backup when storms or fog forced them closer to shore? Coastal piloting offered undeniable advantages. Familiar landmarks, a distinctive cliff, a river mouth, or even the smell of pine carried offshore could confirm their position without relying on celestial tricks. The sagas brim with references to sailors using coastal features like natural lighthouses. In one account, a navigator identifies Iceland by spotting a glacier's reflection on low clouds days before land becomes visible. Another describes a crew recognizing Norway's coast by the unique echo of waves crashing against its steep granite walls. These weren't just stories, they reveal a granular knowledge of geography passed down through generations. Yet critics argue that overemphasizing coastal travel ignores the Vikings' boldest achievements. Ships bound for the Faroe Islands or Iceland would have lost sight of land for weeks, a fact supported by archaeological evidence of open ocean repairs to hulls. Even in Scandinavia itself, treacherous stretches like the Kattegat Strait forced sailors into deep water. If hugging the coast was their primary method, how did they repeatedly cross the North Sea's unforgiving expanse? The answer may lie in balance. Vikings likely treated coastlines as training wheels for novice crews or seasonal shortcuts. Winter voyages often stuck to sheltered routes where ice and storms posed fewer risks, while summer expeditions ventured farther. And let's not overlook their pragmatism. Why brave the open sea when a chain of islands like the Shetlands or Orkneys offered rest, freshwater, and trade opportunities along the way? But here's the twist: coastal navigation demanded its own expertise. Tide charts didn't exist, yet Norse sailors timed departures to ride currents through narrow passages. They memorized submerged rocks that only revealed themselves at low tide and knew which inlets offered shelter from prevailing winds. This wasn't just safe sailing, it was a high-stakes dance with the coastline's moods. So was piloting a fallback or a first choice? Both. The Vikings' genius lay in their refusal to see any method as mutually exclusive. Land, sea, stars. They read them all like pages in the same epic, adapting chapters as the journey required. And that flexibility, more than any single technique, explains how they turned the wildest shores into highways. Hidden within the Icelandic sagas lies a tantalizing reference to the Solarstein, nay, Sunstone, described with almost mystical reverence. The medieval text Hrothulf's Thota tells of King Olaf using such a stone to locate the sun on a cloudy day, guiding his ships when the sky offered no visible clues. But was this a literal tool or just poetic metaphor, another layer of Norse legend wrapped around their seafaring prowess? The debate among historians burns as fiercely as a Viking longhouse fire. On one side, linguistic analysis suggests the term Solarstein might not have referred to a single, specific object. Old Norse texts often used symbolic language. Storms could represent fate, ravens might signal omens. Could the Sunstone have been a narrative device, a way to elevate Viking navigators to near-mythic status? Skeptics point out that no surviving saga explicitly describes its physical use at sea, only its existence in royal or ritual context. Yet another camp argues that dismissing the Solarstein as pure fiction ignores tangible evidence. Beyond the Alderney shipwreck's calcite crystal, Similar artifacts have surfaced in Scandinavian grave sites, some positioned near navigational tools like wooden bearing dials. Laboratory tests show that certain types of Icelandic spar can indeed polarize light, revealing the sun's position through overcast skies when rotated correctly. The process isn't magic, it's optics, a natural phenomenon the Vikings could have observed through trial and error. The heart of the dispute lies in interpretation. Some scholars propose the solarstein wasn't a standalone tool but part of a broader ritual. Imagine a navigator chanting prayers while holding the stone aloft, blending practical observation with spiritual ceremony, a fusion of science and superstition. Others counter that Viking pragmatism would have prioritized function over folklore. If the stone worked, why complicate its use with mysticism? Perhaps the most compelling middle ground comes from experimental archaeology. Reenactors using calcite replicas found that while the technique requires practice, it's feasible under real sailing conditions, but only for those trained in its nuances. This aligns with sagas portraying the solarstein as a rare skill, reserved for elite navigators. Maybe the truth isn't binary. The solarstein could have been both a functional tool and a cultural symbol, its power rooted as much in the hands that held it as in the light it revealed. What's undeniable is how this tiny crystal encapsulates the Viking enigma. Whether literal or legendary, the solarstein reflects a people who turned the mundane into the extraordinary, blurring the line between the seen and the unseen to master a world that refused to be tamed. Among the most controversial claims in Viking navigation studies is the idea that Norse sailors used magnetic lodestones, natural magnets, to guide their ships centuries before compasses appeared in medieval Europe. Could these rough, iron-rich rocks really have been the Vikings' secret to mastering the Atlantic's unseen forces? The debate hinges on a frustrating lack of concrete evidence, leaving historians to piece together clues from scattered sources and speculative experiments. Proponents of the theory point to two compelling threads. First, Norse sagas occasionally mention Lodestones, or leading stones, though descriptions are frustratingly vague. The 13th century Hawksbuck manuscript describes one such stone guiding a ship through fog, but whether this referred to magnetism or mere folklore remains unclear. Second, archaeology confirms Vikings traded in lodestones. A lump of magnetite was found in a 9th century Viking grave in Greenland, though its purpose is unknown. Modern reconstructions show that suspending a lodestone from a cord or floating it on wood could align it with Earth's magnetic field, functioning as a crude compass. When tested in Norwegian fjords, replicas proved surprisingly effective for maintaining general headings, especially when paired with known landmarks. Yet skeptics wield sharp objections. No surviving Viking artifact has been conclusively identified as a navigational compass, and magnetite's presence in graves might reflect symbolic or decorative use rather than seafaring tech. Even if Vikings recognized lodestone's strange pull, could they have systematically applied this knowledge at sea, without the precision of a pivoted needle? A Chinese innovation that wouldn't reach Europe until the 12th century, a drifting lodestone could mislead as easily as guide. The counterargument, though, lies in Viking pragmatism. These were people who repurposed everyday objects ingeniously. Whalebone became sled runners, antlers transformed into fishing hooks. If a lodestone even hinted at directional stability during relentless overcast skies, wouldn't they have experimented? Some researchers propose a hybrid method, using lodestones to calibrate other tools like sun compasses during rare clear moments, then relying on that alignment until the next opportunity. What makes this debate so gripping is its implications. If Vikings did harness magnetism, they leapfrogged Mediterranean navigators technologically, yet left no manual or definitive artifact to prove it. The absence of evidence might reflect organic materials decaying over time, or it could mean that Lodestones was a rare, localized innovation lost to history. Either way, the possibility lingers like a tantalizing phantom in the fog, reminding us that the Vikings' greatest secrets might still be buried, not in soil, but in the quiet gaps between what we know and what we dare to imagine. The Norse sagas speak of a terrifying maritime phenomenon known as havvilla, a disorienting state where seasoned sailors, even under clear skies, found themselves hopelessly lost, their navigation skills crumbling as if the sea itself had betrayed them. Was this sheer human error a quirk of the North Atlantic's deceptive nature, or something darker lurking beneath the waves? The debate cuts to the heart of how Vikings understood the boundaries between skill, luck, and the supernatural. Take the saga of Gudleif Gudlaugsson, whose crew drifted for weeks after being seized by havvilla, only to wash up on an island where inhabitants spoke a language no Norse trader recognized. Stories like these describe more than just navigational mishaps. They evoke an almost sentient malice in the ocean, as if the water itself conspired to mislead. Some historians argue this reflects genuine environmental challenges. The North Atlantic's peculiar currents could create optical illusions, bending light to make distant icebergs appear as land or flattening horizons until direction became meaningless. Under certain conditions, even the sun's position could seem to shift unnaturally, a phenomenon modern sailors call fata morgana. Yet other scholars see havvilla as a cultural lens, a way to explain failure without undermining the Vikings' hard-won reputation as master navigators. Admitting a wrong turn might shame a captain, but blaming havvilla preserved honor, framing the sea as an adversary too cunning to defeat rather than a miscalculation. This duality appears in saga passages where havvilla strikes without warning, as if the gods themselves had clouded the sailors' minds. But here's where it gets fascinating. Modern oceanography reveals that parts of the North Atlantic do behave unpredictably. The meeting of the Gulf Stream and cold Arctic waters creates chaotic eddies, while magnetic anomalies, like those near Iceland, could disrupt lodestones if Vikings used them. Could havvilla have been their term for encountering these real-world dead zones where tools and intuition alike failed? The supernatural angle, though, can't be dismissed. Norse cosmology teamed with ocean spirits, from the world serpent Jörmungandr to the trickster god Loki, who might relish leading ships astray. Navigators carried charms or carved protective runes into hulls, suggesting they saw the sea as a realm where magic and physics intertwined. Perhaps havvilla's power lies in its ambiguity. It wasn't just getting lost, it was the moment when certainty dissolved, forcing sailors to confront how little control they truly had. In an age without charts or rescue, that psychological toll, the creeping dread of an unfixable error, might have been as perilous as the storms themselves. Whether blamed on currents or curses, havvilla reminds us that the Vikings' greatest feats weren't just about conquering the sea, but surviving its caprices. And that's a secret no Sunstone could decipher. Imagine navigating a coastline you'd never seen before, with no maps or charts, just the raw, uncharted wilderness stretching before you. For Viking explorers, this wasn't a hypothetical challenge, it was their reality. One of their most debated secrets was their ability to memorize coastal landmarks with near superhuman precision, turning cliffs, rock formations, and even the color of the water into a mental atlas. But how did this work when they ventured into completely unfamiliar waters, where every coastline was a blank slate? The sagas are filled with examples of this skill. Take the story of Leif Eriksson's voyage to Vinland, where he reportedly recognized the new land not by a pre-existing description, but by matching its features to patterns he'd seen elsewhere, like the way a certain type of seaweed clustered in sheltered bays or how seabird behavior changed near estuaries. This suggests Vikings didn't just memorize static landmarks, they absorbed entire systems of natural signs. A ripple pattern in the water might indicate a submerged reef, while the scent of pine carried on offshore winds could signal a forested inlet miles before it was visible. Critics, though, raise a crucial point. Memorization alone couldn't explain their success in unknown territories. When Bjarni Herjolfsson accidentally sailed past Greenland and spotted North America for the first time, he had no prior reference point, yet he still managed to backtrack and describe the land to others. This hints at something deeper than rote memory. Vikings might have relied on a form of environmental deduction, applying universal coastal principles they'd learned elsewhere. For example, if they knew that fjords in Norway often had specific rock strata or tidal currents, they could watch for similar patterns in unfamiliar lands, building a mental map in real time. But here's where it gets even more fascinating. Recent studies in cognitive archaeology suggest that Viking navigation may have involved story mapping, encoding geographic knowledge into narratives or rhythmic chants. Imagine a crew reciting a poem that listed landmarks in sequence, not just as isolated points, but as a flowing journey. This technique, used by indigenous Pacific navigators, turns geography into an oral tradition, making it easier to recall under stress. A line like "Where the eagle nests atop the split stone, turn toward the midnight sun," isn't just poetry, it's a survival manual. The debate over landmark memorization ultimately reveals a blend of art and science. Familiar coasts were like well-rehearsed songs, every verse known by heart. But new lands, those required improvisation, a mastery of nature's grammar that let them read landscapes like a language they'd always known, even when the words were foreign. And that might be the greatest testament to their genius, the ability to make the unknown feel familiar, one landmark at a time. The North Atlantic is never still, its waters pulse with currents that shift with the seasons, carving invisible highways across the waves. For Viking navigators, these currents weren't just background noise. They were potential allies or deadly adversaries, depending on the time of year. But could the Norse really have predicted these seasonal shifts with enough precision to plan their voyages, or were they at the mercy of the ocean's whims? The answer lies somewhere between myth and meteorology. Consider the Norway current, a warm flow that sweeps up Scandinavia's coast, its strength ebbing and flowing with the seasons. In spring and summer, it becomes a liquid tailwind, speeding ships toward Iceland or Greenland. Winter, though, transforms it into a treacherous opponent as colder Arctic waters clash with the flow, creating choppy, unpredictable seas. Sagas like Eirik Saga Rotha hint at this awareness. Voyages to Vinland were often timed for late summer, when favorable currents could carry ships westward, while return trips waited for autumn's shifts to reverse the advantage. But skepticism lingers. Without tide tables or written records, how precise could this knowledge have been? Modern oceanographers note that currents like the Irminga current near Greenland are notoriously fickle, varying year to year based on ice melt and wind patterns. Critics argue that Vikings likely relied on general trends rather than precise predictions, knowing, for example, that spring tides tended to flow northward, but not the exact day they'd peak. Yet archaeological clues suggest a deeper understanding. Fish bones found in Norse settlements reveal seasonal fishing patterns aligned with current-driven migrations of herring and cod. If Vikings could track fish movements tied to currents, it's plausible they applied that same observational prowess to navigation. Imagine a captain noting that driftwood from Ireland consistently washed ashore in Iceland every August, or that certain seaweed clusters appeared only when a particular current dominated. Over generations, these snippets of data could weave into a working model of the sea's rhythms. The debate sharpens when we examine their boldest journeys. To reach Vinland, ships had to cross the Labrador Current, a cold, southward flow that battles the Gulf Stream. Miscalculating this clash could strand a crew in fog or ice. Yet Norse sagas describe successful round trips, a feat impossible without at least a rudimentary grasp of seasonal flux. Perhaps the truth is less about prediction and more about adaptation. Vikings didn't need to know a current's exact speed. They needed to recognize its signs: the temperature of the water, the behavior of marine life. even the way clouds clustered over warmer flows. Like reading a river's eddies to find the smoothest path, they turned the ocean's pulse into a compass. And in a world where survival hinged on flexibility, that intuitive grasp of the sea's seasons might have been their greatest secret of all. Fog was the Viking navigators' silent enemy, a thick, suffocating blanket that could erase the horizon, mute the stars, and leave even the most seasoned crew adrift in a sightless world. But the saga's whisper of a workaround, sound. When vision failed, Vikings may have tuned their ears to the faintest echoes bouncing off cliffs, the distant cries of seabirds, or even the splash of whales breaching in the murk. It's a theory that bridges ingenuity and desperation, but just how reliable was this auditory lifeline in the chaos of the open ocean? Take the case of Ingolfur Arnarsson, the first permanent Norse settler of Iceland. Legend claims he threw his high-seat pillars overboard in heavy fog, vowing to build his farm wherever they washed ashore. But before that gamble, the saga mentions he listened for waves breaking against land, a technique still used by modern mariners in limited visibility. On a calm day, sound can carry over water for miles, and distinct coastal features like caves or towering rock faces act like natural amplifiers. A skilled navigator might recognize the hollow boom of waves crashing into a sea cave versus the sharper slap of water against a sheer cliff, using these sonic fingerprints to triangulate unseen shorelines. Yet skeptics highlight the glaring flaws in this method. Fog doesn't just obscure vision, it distorts sound. Moisture-laden air bends acoustic waves, creating eerie effects where noises seem to come from the wrong direction. A bird call that sounds meters away might actually be half a mile off, and the roar of breakers could easily be mistaken for wind in the rigging. Even familiar landmarks might betray a crew. An echo that took 2 seconds to return in clear weather could stretch to 4 in dense fog, tricking sailors into thinking they were twice as far from danger as they really were. But the Vikings weren't just passive listeners. Some historians propose they actively created sound cues, like blowing horns toward suspected coastlines and timing the echoes. The King's Mirror describes Norse sailors using horns to signal each other in fog banks, though whether this doubled as navigation remains debated. Another tantalizing clue comes from animal behavior. Seabirds like puffins tend to grow louder near nesting colonies, and migratory whales vocalize more frequently in feeding grounds close to shore. In theory, a navigator could follow these biological breadcrumbs even when cliffs were shrouded. The debate ultimately hinges on adaptability versus precision. Sound navigation wouldn't have worked alone. It was a stopgap, a last resort when every other method failed. Yet in the right conditions, it might have offered just enough information to nudge a ship toward safety. Think of it as the maritime equivalent of feeling your way along a dark hallway, slow, uncertain, but sometimes the only option when the lights go out. And for Vikings, that faint echo in the gloom could mean the difference between finding harbor and becoming another half-villa tragedy lost to the mist. The open ocean might seem like a trackless void, but for Viking traders, certain paths became so well-worn they earned names. Like the Viking route, a maritime highway stretching from Norway's fjords to the bustling ports of Dublin and Hedeby. This wasn't just a random zigzag across the waves. It was a carefully timed dance between seasons, currents, and profit. But how systematic were these routes? Did Vikings follow something resembling a map, or were they more like loose guidelines passed down through generations, flexible enough to bend with storms and pirate raids? Archaeology offers tantalizing clues. Along these corridors, shipwrecks cluster in predictable patterns near sheltered bays where crews likely overnighted, or at narrow straits like the Kattegat, where shoals forced ships into funnel points. Even more telling are the cargoes. Arabic silver in Swedish graves matches coins found in Irish bogs, suggesting not just travel but a web of exchange so regular it created a de facto trade network. Sagas mention navigators using kennings, poetic nicknames for landmarks like Whaleback Ridge or Singing Sands, implying these weren't just descriptions but navigational waypoints memorized like verses in a song. Yet historians clash over how rigidly these routes were followed. Some argue for a near-military precision, with captains adhering to seasonal schedules, spring departures to catch summer currents, autumn returns laden with wool and walrus ivory. They point to the Norse ships, sturdy cargo vessels with deep drafts designed for predictable long-haul routes rather than the agile raiding, longships. But others counter that Viking flexibility was their strength. A storm might force a detour to Orkney. News of a Saxon king's weakness could turn a trader into a raider overnight. The routes weren't rails but rhythms shaped by opportunism as much as tradition. Perhaps the most compelling middle ground comes from analyzing their failures. When the Norse settled Greenland, they clung to familiar southern routes despite the ice shifting, a rigidity that may have contributed to their colony's collapse. Meanwhile, Icelandic sagas celebrate explorers like Ord the Deep-Minded, who veered off known paths to find new harbors. This duality, structure paired with adaptability, might be the real secret of the Vikinga route. It wasn't just about following a path, it was about knowing when to break from it and how to find your way back. Moonlight on the open ocean transforms the night into a silvery highway. At least, that's what some historians believe the Vikings exploited during their long voyages. Under a full moon, especially in the high latitudes of summer when darkness never fully falls, visibility can stretch for miles. But was this deliberate strategy or just a happy accident of timing? The sagas offer cryptic hints. In one account, a navigator waits for the moon to walk the waves before setting course, suggesting lunar cycles played a role in planning. Modern experiments reveal that on clear nights, a skilled observer could distinguish subtle variations in water texture, moonlit ripples revealing current lines, or the faint glow of bioluminescent plankton tracing eddies like liquid constellations. Yet the challenges loom large. Moonlight is fickle cloud cover, or a waning crescent could plunge the sea into inky blackness. Historians who doubt this method point to Norse legal codes, which often prohibited night sailing except in emergencies, implying it was a last resort. Even bioluminescence, while poetic, is unreliable. Those shimmering trails of plankton, they're seasonal, swirling unpredictably with water temperature and algal blooms. A navigator relying on them might find their guiding light vanishing mid-journey, but here's where the debate gets fascinating. Viking longships often carried iron rivets, and recent studies suggest these could react with seawater to produce faint, localized bioluminescence, essentially creating a subtle, ship-borne glow. Could sailors have used this to gauge speed or even maintain formation in darkness? It's a stretch, but not impossible. Meanwhile, lunar navigation would have required deep familiarity with the moon's phases and its effect on tides. The Norse weren't just watching the sky, they were calculating how moonlight illuminated specific coastal features, like the way a fjord's mouth might catch the light at midnight during a summer solstice, turning rock faces into reflective beacons. The truth likely lies in adaptation. Night travel wasn't a primary tactic, but when forced by storms or pursuit, Vikings had tools to mitigate the darkness. Moonlight offered glimpses, bioluminescence hinted at movement, and in the blackest hours they might have fallen back on the oldest skill of all, patience, waiting for the world to brighten enough to reveal the next stretch of the path. After all, the night sea isn't empty. It's just another kind of map, one written in fleeting light and the quiet pulse of the water below. A piece of weathered driftwood bobbing in the waves might seem insignificant, but to a Viking crew far from land, it could be the first whisper of hope. Driftwood doesn't just appear randomly in the open ocean, it's carried by currents from shorelines, often accumulating in predictable patterns. The Norse sagas mention sailors spotting logs or branches and adjusting course based on their origin, interpreting them as nature's signpost. But was this a deliberate navigational tactic or just a lucky guess when all else failed? The answer lies somewhere between ecology and educated intuition. Take the journey of Thorfinn Karlsefni, who reportedly altered his course toward Vinland after encountering driftwood laden with burls, a telltale sign of North American forests. Modern oceanography supports this logic. Driftwood from Siberia and Scandinavia tends to follow distinct currents like the East Greenland drift, while tropical hardwoods float along warmer flows. A seasoned navigator might recognize gnaw marks from beavers absent in Europe but common in North America, or the scent of pine resin still clinging to the wood hinting at nearby forests. Even the type of barnacles crusted on the timber could reveal how long it had been adrift and, by extension, how far it had traveled from land. Yet skeptics argue that driftwood alone couldn't have been a reliable guide. Ocean currents are chaotic, and storms can fling debris hundreds of miles off typical paths. A log spotted near Iceland might have originated in Scotland or even North America, offering no clear directional clue. And while some sagas celebrate driftwood discoveries, others dismiss them as mere curiosities, like the account of a crew mistaking a floating tree for a sea monster, only to laugh at their own paranoia. The debate grows richer when we consider Viking pragmatism. These were people who repurposed every resource from whalebone to seaweed. Driftwood wasn't just a potential navigational aid, it was fuel, carving material, even salvage for ship repairs. In the Norse legal code, stranded driftwood was considered communal property, suggesting its everyday value. So perhaps the truth isn't binary. Vikings likely didn't rely on driftwood as a primary tool, but as one more thread in their intricate web of observation, a clue to cross-reference with bird flights, watercolor, or the taste of the wind. What's undeniable is the poetry of the idea. In a world without satellites or charts, even the humblest object could become a messenger. A splintered plank wasn't just debris, it was a story floating across time and tide, waiting for someone to read it. And if the Vikings turned that story into a compass, even occasionally, it's a testament to their genius for finding direction in the seemingly directionless. Imagine an entire atlas of the Atlantic, every current, coastline, and constellation memorized not on parchment, but in the minds of Viking navigators, passed down through chants, rhymes, and stories around smoky longhouse fires. This was the power of oral tradition, the living library that guided ships across uncharted waters. But how precise could spoken words remain after decades of retelling? The answer reveals a collision between memory and myth, where even the smallest error could strand a ship on the wrong side of the world. The sagas themselves are proof of this system's potential. Take the Hafjörðingoljóð, a Norse poem describing ocean currents in rhythmic verses so precise that modern scholars have matched its descriptions to real tidal patterns off Iceland. Navigational knowledge wasn't just recited, it was ritualized, woven into alliterative verses and kenning's poetic metaphors designed to stick in the mind like hooks. A line like, "The whale road's breath pulls west when the crow's flight shortens," might encode seasonal wind shifts, while a riddle about the sun's bed could hint at ideal latitudes for crossing to Greenland. These weren't mere stories, they were mnemonics turning geography into an oral GPS. Yet the risks of distortion loom large. Studies of oral cultures worldwide show that even critical details mutate over generations. A river's width might blur from 2 bow shots to a morning's row, or a star's rising time might drift by days. The Grönlandinga saga recounts a voyage where a crew missed Vinland entirely, later blaming a misinterpreted instruction about following the midnight sun. Was this a cautionary tale about the fragility of spoken knowledge? Archaeology offers a nuanced perspective. Excavations of Viking-age farmsteads reveal navigational training grounds, stone cairns arranged like coastal landmarks, where young sailors practiced reciting routes while physically walking the patterns. This suggests oral tradition wasn't purely abstract. It was reinforced by physical repetition and apprenticeship, but the system had limits. When Norse settlers reached Greenland, their oral maps failed them. They clung to descriptions of ice-free harbors that had vanished with the medieval warm period, a stark reminder that nature changes faster than memory. The debate over oral traditions' reliability ultimately hinges on adaptability. Vikings didn't treat their chants as immutable laws. They layered them with real-time observation, course-correcting when the stars or currents contradicted the old songs. In a world without writing, this was their lifeline, not perfect but perfectible, as long as each generation listened not just to the words, but to the sea whispering between them. The sleek, shallow-drafted hull of a Viking longship slicing through the waves wasn't just a feat of engineering, it was a navigational instrument in its own right. Historians have long marveled at how these vessels, with their iconic overlapping planks and flexible oak frames, could traverse everything from North Atlantic gales to the shallow rivers of Russia. But was their design purely about durability, or did it encode hidden navigational advantages? The answer lies in a marriage of form and function so precise it still inspires modern shipbuilders. Take the keel, that backbone-like structure running beneath the hull. Viking keels were uniquely tapered, shallow enough to glide over reefs, yet deep enough to bite into the water, providing lateral resistance against cross-currents. This meant a skilled helmsman could hold course even in stiff winds with minimal rudder adjustment, conserving energy on month-long voyages. Experimental archaeology confirms this. Replicas like the Skulderev ships demonstrate how subtle shifts in weight distribution could steer the vessel almost intuitively, turning the ship itself into an extension of the navigator's body. But skeptics counter that design alone couldn't account for transatlantic success. After all, the same basic keel shape appears in earlier Germanic boats that rarely ventured beyond coastal waters. What set Viking ships apart was their adaptability. Features like removable masts allowed them to row when winds failed, while symmetrical hulls enabled instant reversal without laborious turns. This wasn't just about surviving the open ocean, it was about dominating it, turning obstacles into opportunities. The debate intensifies when we examine the Nar, the broader beamed cargo cousin of the longship. Its deeper draft and higher freeboard made it slower but more stable, ideal for hauling settlers and livestock to Greenland. Yet sagas recount Nar's floundering in ice-choked waters where longships slipped through. Some scholars argue this proves navigation relied more on seamanship than shipcraft. Others see it as evidence of meticulous design specialization, where every contour served a purpose. Perhaps the most compelling clue comes from the Gokstad ship's surviving rudder. Unlike medieval stern rudders, Viking side rudders or steerboards sat aft of the keel, creating a pivot point that amplified subtle steering inputs. Modern sailors note this allowed for near-effortless course corrections critical when navigating by stars or birds. Combine this with the hull's responsive flex, and you have a vessel that didn't just endure the sea's moods but danced with them. So was ship design the secret to Viking navigation? Not entirely, but it was the silent partner to every sunstone and star sighting, a masterpiece of engineering that turned the ocean's chaos into a language these sailors could not just read but rewrite. And that, more than any single tool, might explain how they charted a path into history. The Vinland sagas tell of Norse explorers stumbling upon North America centuries before Columbus. But were these voyages deliberate triumphs of navigation or desperate accidents born of storms and miscalculation? The debate over Viking routes to the New World hinges on two clashing interpretations of the same breathtaking feat. Did Leif Erikson and his crew sail west with intent, or were they blown off course only to discover lands they never sought? At the heart of the argument lies the saga of Bjarni Herjolfsson, a merchant who reportedly missed Greenland in fog and sighted unknown shores to the west before correcting course. Some historians see this as proof that Vinland was initially discovered by chance, a navigational error that later expeditions like Leif's exploited intentionally. But others point to archaeology. The Norse settlement at Elance Orks Meadows in Newfoundland reveals deliberate planning, with iron smelting pits and carpentry suggesting long-term occupation. If Vinland were merely an accident, why bring blacksmiths and timber for ship repairs? The skeptic's case rests on oceanography. Crossing the Labrador Current, a frigid, southward flow that battles the Gulf Stream, would have required precise timing to avoid being swept hopelessly off course. Without knowledge of these currents, could even skilled navigators like Ericsson have plotted a reliable path? Yet proponents counter with Inuit oral histories that speak of repeated Norse visits to Arctic Canada, implying sustained contact over generations. A single accidental voyage couldn't explain trade in walrus ivory or the butternuts found at Elance Orks Meadows, which grew hundreds of miles south of the settlement. Perhaps the most tantalizing clue comes from the Vikings' own navigational toolkit. Sagas describe Leif using a soljog, a sun shelf or sun shadow board, to maintain latitude on his return trip. If true, this suggests not just luck but a system for retracing routes. Yet the same texts mention Hafvilla striking Vinland-bound ships, leaving crews disoriented for days. The contradiction speaks to a deeper truth. Viking navigation was never foolproof, blending preparation with adaptability. What settles the debate, if anything, is sheer repetition. The Norse didn't just reach Vinland once, they returned, even attempting colonies. That persistence hints at more than accident. It reveals a culture that turned unpredictability into strategy. Whether by design or drift, they didn't just find the new world. They mapped it into existence, one uncertain voyage at a time. The sky was never just the sky to a Viking navigator. It was a living parchment, scrawled with warnings and invitations written in the swirl of clouds and the whispers of changing winds. While modern meteorology relies on satellites and radar, Norse sailors developed an intimate, almost mystical relationship with weather patterns, turning subtle atmospheric shifts into a survival manual. But how much of this was hard-won observation, and how much was folklore masquerading as fact? The answer lies in a delicate dance between empiricism and the supernatural. Take the Landvitir, the nature spirits Norse culture believed influenced winds and storms. Sagas describe navigators sacrificing to these spirits before voyages, pleading for fair winds. Yet woven into these rituals were astonishingly precise observations. Viking accounts note that certain cloud formations over Iceland's volcanoes reliably preceded gales, while a sudden red sunset in Greenland often signaled coming snow within 2 days. Modern meteorology confirms many of these patterns. Mare's tail's wispy cirrus clouds do indicate approaching fronts, and a halo around the moon, a phenomenon mentioned in the King's Mirror, still warns of impending storms today. Critics argue that for every accurate observation, there were likely just as many misguided ones. The same sagas that correctly link low-flying seabirds to onshore winds also blame sudden squalls on angry ghosts or offended gods. Without systematic record-keeping, how could Vikings distinguish correlation from causation? Yet supporters counter with practicality. These were people who spent lifetimes at sea. When your survival hinges on predicting the next gale, you internalize patterns whether you understand the science or not. A navigator might not know that cumulonimbus clouds signaled convection, but they knew to reef the sails when those anvil-shaped towers darkened the horizon. The debate sharpens when we examine their tools. Some historians suggest Vikings used simple wind vanes, like the one found adorned with a dragon's head in Bergen, to track shifts in air currents. Others point to wind rocks along Norse trade routes, coastal boulders polished smooth by generations of sailors testing wind direction with wet fingers. These methods straddle the line between tool and talisman, blending physics with tradition. Perhaps the most compelling evidence comes from their boldest voyages. Crossing the North Atlantic required timing departures to avoid hurricane seasons or autumn storms, a feat impossible without at least rudimentary seasonal forecasting. When Eric the Red led settlers to Greenland, he reportedly waited for a specific wind pattern that modern climatologists recognize as a lull in the North Atlantic oscillation. Coincidence or the accumulated wisdom of centuries, what's undeniable is the Vikings' holistic approach. They didn't just read weather, they listened to it, smelled it, felt it in their bones. A sudden drop in wave noise might herald fog, while the tang of salt sharpening on the wind could mean open ocean ahead. Superstition and science weren't opposites to them, they were two sides of the same coin, flipped daily on the gamble of survival. And in that grey area between observation and omen, they found a way to sail through storms the rest of Europe wouldn't dare face. Buried deep in Norse sagas lies a peculiar legend, the lodestones or path stone, a mysterious object said to hum, glow, or even tug ships toward safe harbors like an unseen hand guiding them through the dark. Some tales describe it as a lodestone, its magnetic pull steering vessels when stars and sun failed. Others speak of glowing rocks infused with ancestral spirits, whispering directions to those who knew how to listen. But was this pure myth, or could fragments of truth linger beneath the folklore? The answer might lie at the crossroads of geology and Viking ingenuity. Take the account from the Flateyjarbók, where a navigator named Sigurd plants a stone atop a coastal cliff, claiming it would sing to ships approaching the fjord. Modern geologists note that certain rocks, like basalt columns under stress, can emit low-frequency vibrations when wind or waves strike them, sounds that might carry over water like a natural foghorn. Even more compelling are magnetic minerals like magnetite, common in Scandinavia's volcanic rock. A lodestone suspended near such deposits could behave unpredictably, its needle twitching erratically as the ship passed mineral-rich cliffs. To a superstitious crew, that might seem like the stone itself was alive, sensing the path home. Yet skeptics highlight the gaps. No intact lodestone has ever been found in Viking ship burials, unlike sunstones or navigational discs. And while magnetite reacts to magnetic fields, its pull is too weak for precise navigation, more likely to nudge a compass needle than drag an entire longship off course. Some historians propose the lodestone wasn't a physical tool at all, but a metaphor for landmarks like Iceland's phosphorescent singing sands, where quartz crystals emit eerie sounds underfoot. Navigators might have used these sonic or luminous quirks as waypoints, later romanticizing them in sagas, but here's where archaeology throws a curveball. In two Viking Age graves in Denmark, excavators found small, iron-rich stones placed beside navigational tools. One bore runes roughly translating to "guide me," a tantalizing hint that some stones held ritual significance. Experiments show that when struck, these rocks produce resonant tones, supporting theories of acoustic navigation. Picture a crew listening for the harmonic hum of a familiar cliffside boulder, its pitch changing as they adjusted course. The lodestone's true power may have been psychological. In the crushing isolation of the North Atlantic, faith in a guiding stone, whether magnetic, sonic, or divine, could steady panicked crews when storms erased all other landmarks. That's the irony. Even if the stones didn't physically steer ships, belief in them might have. And in navigation, where confidence is as vital as compasses, that's no small secret at all. Cutting through the waves at sunrise, a Viking captain wouldn't have had a logbook or speedometer, yet somehow, he'd know whether his ship was a day or a week from the next fjord. Estimating speed and distance across open water without modern tools seems impossible today, but the Norse developed a suite of ingenious, if imperfect, methods to track their progress. The sagas speak of diger and doger, units of time that roughly translated to half-days or full days of sailing. But how did they calculate these intervals when the sea itself was their only clock? One theory centers on the simple act of observation. By timing how long it took a piece of driftwood to float from the bow to the stern, a crew could estimate speed. If the ship was, say, 80 feet long and the wood took 10 seconds to pass, basic math would suggest they were moving at roughly 5 knots. But critics highlight the flaws. Currents could distort the driftwood's path, and waves might obscure the count. Even more telling, Viking ships varied dramatically in size. What worked for a 30-foot fishing vessel wouldn't scale to a 100-foot longship. Another method involved rhythm. Some historians suggest navigators used chants or steady drumbeats to maintain a consistent rowing pace, then multiplied the strokes by the ship's known speed per stroke. The King's Mirror describes crews marking time with sung verses, their oars dipping in unison like a metronome. Experimental archaeologists have tested this, finding that trained rowers in replica ships could maintain speeds within a narrow range for hours, allowing rough distance estimates. But storms or fatigue would shatter this precision, leaving crews guessing. Then there's the celestial approach. Vikings might have tracked the sun's arc across the sky, noting how long it took to shift from one landmarker, like the mast shadow hitting a specific deck plank, to another. On a clear day, this could offer a crude chronometer, but under clouds or in the midnight sun of northern summers, the system collapsed. Even the North Star's movement, reliable for direction, couldn't precisely measure speed. The debate hinges on pragmatism versus precision. Vikings likely layered multiple techniques, cross-referencing rowing rhythms with bird sightings or the taste of saltwater, knowing, for example, that certain currents carried distinct mineral flavors as they neared land. A day's travel might be 3 bird flights and 2 tide changes rather than a fixed mileage, and when all else failed, they relied on collective memory. Generations of sailors internalized how long it took to sail from Bergen to the Faroes in fair wind, then adjusted for storms or detours. The genius of their system wasn't accuracy, it was adaptability. Without rigid numbers, they embraced uncertainty, treating distance as a living thing that stretched and shrank with the mood of the sea. In the end, maybe that's why they thrived where others faltered. They didn't just measure the waves. They learned to move with them. Before setting sail, Viking crews would often gather on shore for ritual sacrifices to Odin for fair winds or chants invoking Njord, god of the sea. But were these ceremonies merely spiritual comfort, or did they encode hidden navigational wisdom? The line between prayer and practicality blurs in Norse seafaring, where gods and geography intertwined. Take the accounts of blots, sacrificial rites where animal blood was sprinkled on sails and prows. To modern eyes, this seems purely superstitious, but historians note these rituals often coincided with key departure times, like the spring thaw when ice cleared from northern passages. A sacrifice to Thor might have been as much about timing as faith, aligning voyages with optimal seasonal currents. Skeptics dismiss such connections as coincidence, pointing to saga passages where rituals failed spectacularly, like the tale of a crew drowning despite lavish offerings to Aegir, the sea giant. Yet archaeological evidence complicates the picture. At Norse harbors like Ribe in Denmark, excavated altars sit precisely at vantage points where navigators could observe sunrise alignments over distant headlands. Were these shrines or solar markers? The Osterfaravisur, a medieval poem, describes sailors chanting while sighting mountain peaks through notched stones, blending incantation with what sounds like primitive surveying. The debate sharpens around land-taking rituals where settlers threw carved pillars overboard, vowing to build where they washed ashore. Was this blind faith or a shrewd use of currents? Experiments show pillars tossed into Icelandic waters often drift predictably toward sheltered bays, natural gathering points for flotsam. Could generations of observation have turned ritual into a rough science? Even the gods' domains hint at practicality. Njord wasn't just a deity of the sea. He ruled winds and fire, elements critical to navigation and ironworking for ship repairs. Perhaps the truth lies in synthesis. Vikings didn't separate the sacred from the strategic. A chant to Freya for fertile lands might double as a mnemonic for coastal landmarks where the golden barley grows, signaling a river delta's rich soil. When fog swallowed the horizon, rituals provided structure, a way to focus minds while waiting for nature's cues. In a world where survival hinged on reading subtle signs, faith wasn't the opposite of reason. It was the lens that made the unknowable feel navigable, and that might be the most profound secret of all. Sometimes the surest compass was the one etched not in stone or stars, but in the space between prayer and pragmatism. Among the most mesmerizing and debated navigational artifacts from the Viking Age aren't tools or charts, but verses. The Rimur, epic Icelandic poems passed down through generations, are studded with cryptic lines that some historians believe hold hidden sailing directions. Picture a chant describing the fjord where the eagle turns thrice, or the rock that drinks the midnight sun. Could these have been more than just vivid imagery? Were the Rimur a secret atlas sung aloud to guide sailors across the waves? The theory gains traction when you examine verses like those in the Embark, which meticulously lists coastal features in rhythmic sequence. One stanza pinpoints a harbor by referencing two cairns like broken teeth, and descriptions so precise that modern archaeologists have identified matching rock formations in Newfoundland. Another poem speaks of sailing 9 doga west of the whale's back, a phrase that aligns eerily with the travel time between Greenland and Labrador when accounting for Viking ship speeds. Proponents argue these weren't arbitrary numbers. They were calibrated instructions wrapped in poetry to survive oral tradition intact, yet skeptics counter with equal fervor. Many Rimur were composed centuries after the Viking Age, romanticizing rather than documenting routes. The broken teeth cairns might have been common coastal markers, their inclusion in verse merely decorative. Even more damning, some directional stanzas contradict known sailing realities. A line in the Eirik Saga Rotha claims Vinland lay 2 nights' row from Helluland, but ocean currents make that timeline impossible without supernatural speed. The debate deepens when we consider performance. Rimur weren't just recited, they were sung, with melodies that may have mirrored wave rhythms or wind patterns. Researchers at the University of Reykjavik discovered that certain verse meters align with the cadence of oar strokes needed to cross specific currents. Was this intentional, a way to synchronize rowers while subtly reinforcing navigational timing, or just poetic serendipity? Archaeology offers a tantalizing middle ground. At a Norse farmstead in Greenland, excavators found a wooden tablet inscribed with runes that, when sung aloud, match the stress patterns of a rimmer describing local fjords. This suggests some poems could have functioned as auditory maps, where the very act of chanting triggered muscle memory in seasoned sailors. Imagine a helmsman humming a verse and feeling his hands twitch the rudder at a key phrase, like a subconscious turn signal. What's undeniable is the Rimur's dual power. Whether mnemonic or myth, they bound geography to memory in a world without paper charts. A sailor might forget a list of landmarks, but a line of poetry, with its alliteration and rhythm, that could outlast storms, years, even generations. And in the end, that's the real secret. The Vikings didn't just navigate by the stars or the waves. They sailed by song, letting the old verses pull them home like a tide. From sunstones whispering through clouds to the haunting cry of seabirds guiding ships to land, the Vikings' mastery of the sea remains one of history's most thrilling puzzles. We've sailed through 25 of their most fiercely debated navigation secrets, each one a testament to how the Norse turned the unpredictable ocean into a path. Were they scientists reading nature's subtle cues, or poets interpreting the wind's riddles? Perhaps both. The fact that historians still spar over these methods, whether the Uunartoq Disc was a true sun compass or a child's toy, if lodestones stones truly hummed with magnetic power, or how much moonlit waves really revealed, proves these explorers left us more than just legends. They left a mystery that refuses to be anchored. What makes Viking navigation endlessly captivating isn't just their tools or techniques, but the audacity behind them. Imagine trusting a piece of crystal to outsmart the fog, or memorizing coastlines like epic sagas passed down through generations. These weren't just sailors, they were alchemists turning intuition into precision. And that's the real magic. Every theory we debate today, from whale paths to star charts, keeps their spirit alive. After all, history isn't just about answers. It's about the questions that keep us searching. So what's your take? Could Viking ships really have ridden magnetic stones like some ancient autopilot? Or were their feats built on something even rarer, an unshakable dialogue with the sea itself? Drop your wildest theories in the comments below, and if you're hungry for more historical enigmas, don't forget to subscribe. The past is full of uncharted waters, and we're just getting started. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and remember, sometimes the greatest discoveries begin with a single, impossible idea.